Okay, lecture two. We're mostly going to be talking about the cerebrum in this one and the divisions and functions of different areas. But I'm going to show you my mug here really quickly. This is a brain mug that one of my students last semester got me because I'm a neuro guy, and teaching this this portion of the course is like, man, I mean, I know it all. You know, I've worked with a lot of these different anatomical structures for a while, but the brain was one of the first ones I worked on. And just recently, I worked at Mayo doing some programming for some reprogramming a program that's used to get fMRI data. So we were trying to fix some old programs and update it to the newest levels. That's what I was doing before I was hired in my current position. So that was kind of fun. It's always fun working with fMRI stuff. Anyway, all right, onto the thing. Let me click in here. Okay. So there's four main lobes on the outside of the brain that we can see easily. There's a fifth lobe that we're going to be talking about in a few seconds. But you can see here you've got the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. When we get to the facial structures, and we start talking about the bones of the face, we'll also talk about the bones of the skull. And if you remember these lobes, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, you'll also remember the bones that cover these areas. They're named the same thing. So learn them now, and then you won't have to learn them later. You'll ace that portion. What these mostly do, I mean, this is way oversimplified, but the frontal lobe, a lot of speech processes, you know, a lot of your higher level functions of speech and everything, actually. Decision making is up there. Planning, a lot of higher level things. The parietal lobe, there's some speech there as well. Also sensory integration, so putting visual information together with auditory information, putting touch information together with olfactory and taste information. So like, what are you experiencing when you're eating? The occipital lobe is pretty much just vision. That's really all that goes on there. And the temporal lobe, I have it as just hearing. There's different things that go on there, but one of the main functions there is hearing. How can you remember these? Well, the frontal lobe is in the front. The occipital lobe is the opposite of the front, so it's O, occipital, opposite. If you've heard recently, which I guess some of this was disproved, but there's this osseous protuberance that some people have. People that are like my age and younger have this osseous protuberance that grows at the bottom. I have one, actually. It's right here at the bottom of my skull, bottom of the back part of my skull. And, you know, the first paper that came out was like, using the cell phone gives young people horns. But it's actually just this little osseous protuberance that could be from neck muscles pulling from looking down. Kind of like we talked about in the very last module, or the very last lecture, that early hominid had a sagittal crest so that there could be more strength pulling the muscles that attach to that area. It could be that this grows because of the neck muscles that are pulling on the head when you look down at your phone or when reading. I mean, I did not grow up with a phone, but I was always reading, so I wonder if that's what it's from. It could also just be that a good percentage of the population just have these. It's not related to cell phone or reading. The temporal lobe is underneath your temples right here, so that's temporal lobe. And the cerebellum, which isn't one of the main lobes of the cerebrum. It's its own separate thing that we'll talk about, but cerebellum, below the brain. So that's one way that I remember that. There's also I mean, you see the surface of the brain here is very wrinkly, right? Where's my cursor? So it's all this wrinkled surface. One of the main things that you learn probably in grade school anatomy is this wrinkly surface of the brain. Well, the portions that come up are called, it's a gyrus, or multiple of them are gyri. And then when it wrinkles down, it's a sulcus, or the plural would be sulci or sulci. Some people say sulcus too, but that, I don't know. Sounds like salsas. This makes me hungry. So this is a gyrus. This is a sulcus. And some of them are more pronounced than others, right? I mean, you'll have sulci that are very deep, and those are usually ones that we use to orient ourselves in the brain to where we are. You can think of gyri as hills and sulci as valleys. And then also, you probably know this, but the more wrinkles there are in the brain, it gives it more surface area, which allows there to be more gray matter. That's why it has this wrinkly appearance, is just so there can be more surface area in there. You should remember from the last lecture that you think, well, why does there need to be surface area? Because if you didn't have wrinkles, then to have the surface area, you just have that area taken up with brain, right? Well, remember, the exterior edges of the brain, the ones that are more distal, is where the actual cell bodies are located. So there's just a kind of a small corona of cell bodies around the brain that is actually where thought and consciousness and processing and stuff like that is taking place. A lot of the inside part of the brain is white matter, where these things are making connections. So you do need the surface area. That's where the actual cell bodies live. So the more wrinkly it can be, the more actual outside surface area you have, and that's a good thing. All right, so like I said, there are some sulci that are a lot deeper, like this one here, the central sulcus. This separates the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And it's just a very deep, continuous sulcus, but it is a sulcus because there is brain tissue down below that valley. So the central sulcus is going to run right here. And then you've got these other things called fissures, right? So you've got the Sylvian fissure right here. That separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe right here, and it also separates the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe here. A fissure is different than a sulcus because a fissure actually, in most places, the brain is not connected. So if you think about the brain, so the temporal lobe is kind of like your thumb, actually, where if you wrap it like this, it's right in front, but it can be disconnected like that. It can come out like that. And that's exactly what the temporal lobe does. It's connected at the back part, closer to the occipital lobe, but it is its own structure that then wraps around. So the fissure is where there's actually nothing holding it. So the Sylvian fissure this would not be Sylvian fissure right here between the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. In fact, the division between temporal and occipital isn't as well defined as between a lot of other lobes. You have the transverse fissure here as well, which is really just the bottom of the brain. It separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum, right? So here's the cerebellum, here's the cerebrum, and the transverse fissure separates the two. And then the last one is the longitudinal fissure. This one's pretty easy, though. It runs, along the distance of the brain and separates the two hemispheres. Two hemispheres are connected by what? You remember? Corpus callosum. So mostly they're apart, though. All right. So here is what I want you to do is, if you are not ready to take a brief quiz on what you just learned, pause this video and come back to it, because you're going to take this quiz for points. It's one of the assignments. So I'm going to quiz you on lobes and fissures and sulci. It's not worth a ton of points, so if you want to just go ahead and try it, you can. All right, so if you are ready, then here we go. So what is A? What is B? What is C? What is D? What is E? What is F? Now G moves, so what is G? Watch, here's where it goes. What is that? What is H? What is I? And what is J? All right, so you finished that. Hopefully you did pretty good. If we want to go back, get the correct answers really quickly. A is the temporal lobe, B is the cerebellum, C is the brainstem, D is also the frontal lobe, here and here. Well, wait, sorry, I got to use my cursor. Here and here. D is the frontal lobe here, and it's also the frontal lobe here. E is the parietal lobe, F is the occipital lobe, G is the central sulcus, H is the sylvian fissure, I is the transverse fissure, and J is the longitudinal fissure. There it goes. All right, and then the last one, remember I said there were 5 lobes. The last one that you can't see is called the insula. So the way that you see it is you have to, so if this is your brain, you have to kind of pull down the temporal lobe and look into your fist right here. And that would be where the insula is located. Sometimes it's called the insular cortex. Insula processes visceral emotions like disgust. And that works 2 ways. So if you show people pictures of Kasu Marzu cheese, if you know about this cheese, it's disgusting, right? But it's this cheese where it gets infested with maggots, and they eat it. And then the time when it is actually ripe and ready to be consumed is when the maggots have eaten it, and then the maggots have died. And so then you eat this cheese that, anyway, it's super gross. When you show people pictures of that who don't enjoy it, their insula, lights up in an fMRI machine. There's more activity in the insula. But when you show people pictures of someone that they dislike, so like an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend or an ex-spouse or politicians that they don't like, you can show them pictures of these people, and the insula also works there. So that's evidence that we kind of process people we don't like. When we say we're disgusted by them, we actually are disgusted by them in the same way that we are this cheese with maggots in it, which is gross. So anyway, visceral emotions. Some types of fear are visceral emotions. So typically the amygdala, which we'll talk about later, is where emotions are processed, and fear is often processed in the amygdala, but that's kind of like higher level fear. But that really intense, like shivering kind of fear tends to be processed in the insula. Some research studies show that the insula is involved in consciousness and speech. It's involved in some homeostasis along with the hypothalamus. Some motor control, including swallowing, is done in the insula. And then also like your sense of self and like that this is my hand, that may be processed in the insula as well. So I consider the insula a 5th lobe. It's useful to talk about it that way. And in fact, this picture down below me, my video is covering it. So that's inconvenient. Let me see if I can move me. This picture right here shows you that it looks like another lobe under there. So like this insula right here looks a lot like what's on top, which is good evidence that it might be its own lobe. So anyway, some researchers consider it a fifth lobe. Other people don't care. Whether we call it a lobe or not, it's the insula. It's worthy of research. I'm going to call it a fifth lobe for this class. I want you to think of it as a fifth lobe. You can make up your mind afterwards, but when I ask you on an exam, how many lobes are there? There's 5. All right. So now we have some interesting organization going on in the cortex too. We have something going on called functional mapping. There's 3 different types of functional mapping that go on, that occur in the cortex that we'll see. One is somatotopic, and that just means that well, soma is body, right? And topic is just how it's laid out. So it's laid out with the body. And what you can see here is this is your motor cortex, and it's laid out approximately like the body is. So you have your feet down here, goes up to your leg, thigh, pelvis, trunk, arm, forearm, and fingers. So that's, you know, kind of like moving up the body. Then you've got face, tongue, and the inside of your throat for swallowing. So you kind of, it moves from the toes. This is motor area, from the toes up, face, and then in, right? So it's very body centric. It's laid out just like the body is. This is the somatosensory cortex. So this is how you receive feeling. This is your tactile sense, and it's laid out just like the body as well, right? So it's a almost exact mirror image of the motor cortex over here, the somatosensory cortex. So that's somatotopic, laid out like the body. There's also tonotopic. This is how the primary auditory cortex is laid out. So tono, like tone, which would just be frequency, and then topic, how it's laid out. And you can see here that the primary auditory cortex is laid out. So dark blue is low frequency and yellow is high frequency. So the primary auditory cortex goes from low frequency to high frequency. Retinotopic, this is how the visual cortex and the occipital lobe is laid out. That just means that what we actually see out in the world, that's how the occipital cortex is mapped, right? That's how it functions. So if people are seeing this kind of rainbow series of rings, you can see that back here in their brain, they're looking at the purple rings down here, and that moves up to yellow and finally to blue out here. So we see it in the world like this, and then in the brain, it's a perfect representation of that thing that we're looking at. So these are 3 different types of mapping. The idea here is that whatever the function is of that area, your brain is going to be laid out in accordance with that function, right? So it's not really that there's 3 different types of functional mapping. It's kind of that there is one thing. It's functional mapping. And how that signal comes in, your brain is going to organize itself to take full advantage of that signal that's coming in, whether it's visual information, auditory information, tactile information, or sending out motor signals. We've talked about white and gray matter, but really what I want to show you here is this is visualizing tracts. So this is using DTI, which stands for diffusion tensor imaging. Sorry. We can actually visualize neural tracts. Remember, it's tracts inside the central nervous system. Outside in the PNS, it would be a nerve, right? So inside the brain, in the cortex, it is a tract. And so you can see that the right eye has a tract that comes over. This is the optic chiasm here. Some fibers cross over, some don't. And then you have this tract for the right visual field that comes over and goes to the left side of the brain. I say right visual field because actually It's not everything from the right eye. It's just the right visual field that goes to the left side of the brain. So it would be the right side of the right eye and the right side of the left eye that go to the left hemisphere. Anyway, diffusion tensor imaging and tracts. Okay, we've talked about the corpus callosum too. The corpus callosum is a bundle of white matter fibers that allow the right and left hemisphere to talk to each other. Corpus means body, so does soma, but corpus also means body. And then callosum means tough, like callus. The dense bundle of myelinated axons make it difficult to cut through if you're doing, if you're doing a cadaveric study. So if you're cutting the brain apart to look at it, it's difficult to cut through, much more difficult than the rest of the brain. And that's because of those myelinated axons. The reason why I want to talk about the corpus callosum again is because it is mirrored by the corona radiata. So the corpus callosum connects left and right hemispheres. The corona radiata is what connects brain to body. So it's a large white matter tract that heads downwards instead of across. You can see it, all these different pictures here. This is the original drawing from the Gray's Anatomy text. The corona radiata comes from all the other individual areas of the brain, and they coalesce and then start moving down towards the brainstem, towards the spinal cord. In the more distal areas of the brain, it's going to be corona radiata when it's kind of out, splayed out. So out here, it's corona radiata. Out here, it's corona radiata. And then it bundles down into the internal capsule. So about right here, you can see on this one, it's labeled internal capsule. Here, where they come much closer together, it's internal capsule. This one has mostly been cut through, it looks like. You can see a little bit of an internal capsule right here. So corona radiata becomes the internal capsule. This is absolutely giving away one of the questions in the lab that you're going to have to do for one of the neuro labs. That's okay, because it is really difficult to see it in the video that we have for that question. It's not the best video. So remember this slide. We talked about lateralization and specialization too. I just want to go over a couple numbers here. So there's going to be some blood on the upcoming slides. So if you're sensitive to that, watch out. Lateralization, again, these functions are governed only by one hemisphere. So we talked about this, but most right-handers, 95% roughly, speech is governed on the left side. About 75% of left-handers have speech governed on the left side. Left-handers are kind of strange because some of them have like brains that are just completely mirror images of right-handers. Others have brains that look just like right-handers. They just happen to use their left hand. So it's an interesting population. When we do work with fMRI, we do specify, though, that we want right-handers. We don't want to deal with that, those few left-handers that have complete mirror images of their brain. Music is sort of, there's evidence that it's a little bit more governed on the right side. And then, like we talked about, motor control for the right side of the body is governed on the left side. The WADA test, I have a video about that. If you're interested in it, there's not really any questions about it on the exam, maybe an extra credit question here and there about the WADA test. But that's used to determine hemispheric use, like what's governed by which hemisphere. And then also there's something called hemispheric neglect. I've got a video on that too. There's no... Again, maybe an extra credit question, but hemi-neglect is really interesting. This is when someone can have brain damage to one side and then start completely ignoring that side of their body, of their conscious experience, rather, not just of their body, but everything in the world is kind of ignored on that side. So you can see here that This clock is missing everything on the left. This house is missing everything on the left. The flower has nothing on the left side. And also the person, when they're grooming themselves, will neglect their left side. So that's pretty interesting. So that's lateralization. Now specialization, we talked about, I don't know if I talked about Heschel's gyrus. I did. I talked about primary auditory cortex, which is Heschel's gyrus. There's also the fusiform face area. That's just kind of specializes in processing faces. It's down here. So you've probably heard of face blindness or prosopagnosia, and people who have a damaged fusiform face area don't remember faces. So they have no idea if a person that they're seeing is someone that they've met before. That's an example, another example of specialization. Sometimes I feel like I have pastapagnosia because it's hard for me to tell the difference between like linguini and fusilli. But that, you know, I don't know, not a big deal. It all tastes the same anyway. Okay, so let's talk about some subdivisions of the frontal lobe. Broca's area is in the frontal lobe. This is a big one that you'll hear about in a lot of classes going forwards. Broca's area's main function is speech production. When I say speech production, I do mean that in both senses that you could think of it. So speech production in terms of it's involved in which words are being planned for the speech utterance, but also it is involved in actually like doing the motor planning of the speech, or initiating the actual motor control for the speech. You can see the motor strip is about right here, and so the bottom portion, which is roughly aligns with where, you know, the mouth would be in the somatotopic map, is here within Broca's area. So it's heavily involved in speech production and different aspects of speech production. Here's the prefrontal cortex. This is usually where executive functioning happens, all these other things that are on here. Then we've got the premotor cortex. This is usually like planning motor movements, incorporating sensory guidance. So if you're moving towards something, you're kind of using visual information to guide your hand towards something. So that would be premotor. And then primary motor right there. Like I was saying, Broca's area overlaps with this primary motor area for the mouth, the premotor area for the mouth, and also some of the prefrontal cortex as well. The primary motor is where all of your motor impulses are generated. And that's the frontal lobe. Oh, sorry. Supplementary motor area is up here at the top. And it's just another one that's involved in planning motor movements. Oh yeah, I did want to talk about this. So it seems like as you move towards the front of the brain, things get more abstract and more high level. So towards the rostral portion of the frontal lobe, that's where things are very strictly planned out. Motor things, A equals B, right? A plus B equals C, I guess I should say. 1 + 1 = 2. And then as you move forwards, then you start thinking about like, well, what happens if I did this? Or what if 1 + 1 = 3 or something, you know, like that. So this is, as you move forward, this is kind of the, most of our conscious experience is kind of governed up there. We've talked mostly about this. In fact, I'm not even sure if we need to go over it. Primary motor cortex is here at the dorsal portion of the, or sorry, the rostral portion of the frontal lobe, and then your primary somatosensory cortex is at the caudal portion of the parietal lobe. So they're right next to each other, right across the central sulcus from each other. That's really the important thing to get from this slide. And then here's the parietal lobe. Again, we've got somatosensory cortex, which is just processing all of your touch, temperature, vibration, and proprioception, which is feeling where you are in space. You've got the posterior parietal cortex here, which is a lot of sensory integration. So like we talked about, putting a visual and auditory stimulus together. But it also is involved in types of planning motor movements, which is interesting because that's also premotor. But a lot of our motor movements incorporate sensation that's coming in with producing more motor movements. So like we talked about, using sensory guidance. So there's strong links between the posterior portion of the parietal lobe and the premotor cortex. The angular gyrus is this tiny little area right here that's actually been shown to be very active for mathematical language and math processing, and also spatial cognition. Oh, and high-level language is processed there as well. So when I say high level, it says metaphor here, but like similes, metaphors, all that flowery kind of language, stuff that doesn't have necessarily a direct map. It needs to be analyzed and considered, right? And then you've got another tiny little gyrus here, the supramarginal gyrus. That's just another interesting area that relates speech to words, so a long section of speech to individual words. And then also another area that does motor planning. And this is possibly indicative of a structure that as you're listening to someone talk to you, this might be an area that's involved in generating feedback. So it might be generating words or ideas that are feedback to what you're hearing, which then links to the frontal portion decision making and back to the motor cortex. Here's a picture again of what's going on in the brain, all the different speech functions of the brain. So we've got Broca's area, the supramarginal gyrus, the angular gyrus. And the size of those differ depending on what different papers you read, different textbooks you look at. What we know is that it's an area. fMRI is really good at showing approximately where something is, but if it's very small, we might smooth it out to about 5 millimeters. In the brain, 5 millimeters is pretty large. So, and it also isn't necessarily in the exact same place for all of our participants. So when you have 6 participants who have slightly different areas where their supramarginal gyrus might be, and then we smooth out where that is, it kind of looks like it's in this large area. So again, some papers show that it's a larger area than others, but what is true is we know approximately where it is and what kind of functions it's involved with. Here's the primary auditory cortex, which we'll talk about more in a second when we look at the temporal lobe. That's also called Heschel's gyrus. And then there's Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is usually, you might hear this in your classes going forward, that it's involved in speech comprehension. But a paper that came out in 2017 said that it's a large meta-analysis, which just means looking at all of the literature that's come out in the last 10 years, that Wernicke's area actually doesn't have anything to do with speech and shouldn't even be referred to as an area. So that's the current state of Wernicke's area, the current state of the neuroanatomy of speech and speech comprehension. It's important to know Wernicke's area, though, because it's possible that you're in your future careers as you go on through other classes, this might not have reached the textbooks yet, or it might not have reached other instructors yet. So it's important to know what Wernicke's area is. It's also important to know the current state of research, that it actually has no part to play. All right, so the temporal lobe, again, this is the primary auditory cortex. That's where basic auditory features are processed. Here's the superior temporal gyrus. This is more high-level auditory perception and speech perception that goes on here. This is where Wernicke's area is in this back portion over here, the one labeled 42. And then there's the planum temporale, which is still useful. This is the one that I talked about where it's larger on the left than it is on the right. So you can see here that the planum temporale on the left is very large, and on the right it's pretty small. This is indicative that the planum temporale is important for speech comprehension, but not so much for music or other sounds that might be processed on the right side. Interestingly, the planum temporale is less asymmetric for people with dyslexia. So that could show that they actually have like a morphological difference, morphological meaning like a physical difference in their brain, how their brains have grown, that give rise to dyslexia. So that's pretty interesting. When I say less asymmetric, I mean you would expect that the size of the purple area over here is roughly equal to the size of the purple area here for someone with dyslexia. And then lastly, you have this middle temporal gyrus here, which is associated with the names of objects and the names of certain actions. So let's say if you're a fan of, I guess, football, right? Different types of passes, different types of plays might have different names. This is an area that might be active in naming those different actions. All right, we're getting close here. Just quickly, a little bit of stuff about Broca's area. It is involved, we talked about, there's a little bit involved in speech comprehension. We talked about how it's involved in speech expression and speech production, but it's also involved in speech comprehension, which is interesting because it's in the frontal lobe, more close to this primary motor area. It's also involved in the production and processing of speech-like gestures too. So everything that I'm doing with my hands while I'm talking to you is also being processed by Broca's area, which would mean then that a lot of sign language is governed in the same area that spoken language is. It's also possibly active in recognizing the same motor actions of others, just in the same way that it's utilized in comprehending other people's speech. So it's a really interesting area. Brodmann areas, I'm not going to ask you much about them. You'll see them in the book. It's just an older way of identifying different structures, so it's okay. You don't necessarily need to know that. I've got a little bit in here about the arcuate fasciculus, which typically runs between Wernicke's area and Broca's area. It may not run between Wernicke's area. It may run between the angular gyrus, actually, is what some of the new research is showing. But the arcuate fasciculus is important for mimicking sounds. So if you damage the arcuate, if you damage Broca's area, you end up with Broca's, well, you don't always end up with Broca's aphasia, right? The different aphasias crop up from different strange types of brain damage. You'll get more about that if you take Dr. Rogalski's course in traumatic brain injury. But the very simplified version is if you damage Broca's area, you get Broca's aphasia. If you damage Wernicke's area, you get Wernicke's aphasia. If you damage the arcuate fasciculus, which is the link between the two of them, you don't actually get either of those types of aphasias. What you actually get is an impairment in being able to mimic someone else's speech or mimic other sounds that you hear. So it doesn't have the same challenges. It doesn't cause the same types of impairment that a typical aphasia might. There's also, this is really interesting to me, is that stuttering is linked to a subactive Broca's area. So looking at the brains of people who stutter, Broca's area isn't as active. It doesn't show as much blood flow to it when people are talking if you're a stutterer. So for most of us, we're not stutterers. There's a large amount of blood flow going to Broca's area as we're talking. For stutterers, not as much. There is some, but not as much as, significantly less than people who don't stutter. And then again, like I said, you have expressive aphasias that are related somewhat to damage to Broca's area. I've got a video on different types of aphasias. No questions on an exam about that, just if you're interested. They're good videos to take a look at. They're very interesting. Well, Wernicke's area, like I just said, you don't need to know this because we've mostly just figured out that it isn't anything. This is the real current state of different areas of the brain active for speech, for different types of speech. You don't need to remember this for a test. You don't need to remember any of these areas that I'm showing you right now. The other ones you do. But what I'm showing you now is like, this is when you get a doctorate and you're looking at speech and hearing and comprehension and stuff like that, the kind of work that I'm doing, this is the model that you're going to end up looking at. The point of this is to show you that speech is a very complex process, right? We do it all the time. It seems very easy, but it's very complex. And this is why it's hard for us to exactly predict what kind of disorders, what kind of communication disorders people might present with different types of brain injuries. So anyway, the one takeaway from this is it's a complex thing to look at in the brain. Speech is not able to be boiled down to just Broca's area and Wernicke's area and the arcuate fasciculus. It's a much more intricate thing. However, that said, knowing the big basics of Broca's area and the angular gyrus and places like that is helpful. It's just that you can, as you go forward, you'll modify what each of those areas do and think of them as maybe 2 or 3 separate areas instead of one. All right, that's the end of this lecture. So you got one more to go, and then your week is done.